Welcome everyone. Apologies for the delay. We had a couple of minor technical issues which have been resolved and hopefully won't reoccur. As I said, welcome everyone to this Climate Bonds Initiative webinar in conjunction with EUROPace. We very much appreciate your interest and attendance today. I'm Claire Muldoon. I'm a policy manager at CBI and I will be your moderator today. Firstly, a couple of housekeeping notes. The session will be recorded. And if you wish to ask any of our panelists a question, please put your question in the chat function, noting who it is directed to, and hopefully we will have time after all the panelists speak to address as many questions as possible. We will first hear from David Gabrielson of Pace Nation. Pace Nation is a movement of people and organizations who are joined in their support for PACE financing. Following David, Mark Jacobs of G&E Finance will describe EUROPace's journey to date. And then Emma Harvey will outline developments at the Green Finance Institute. And rounding up the session, we have Gary Zhao of BRE China and Shay Singh of Tether Limited, who will share their views from their respective regions. I will now hand over to David to kick off the conversation.
Thank you, Claudia, and it's nice to meet all of my fellow panelists. I am David Gabrielson. I was sort of the founding executive director of Pace Nation, which in the United States is classified as a 501c3 nonprofit, meaning mainly in sort of an educational and resource organization to support energy efficiency finance in the form of PACE. My own background is sort of illustrative of, I guess, a lot of the way PACE has evolved in the US in some respects. I spent most of my career in finance, in municipal, local government finance, structuring bond issues to build infrastructure in the United States and various states and cities and whatnot throughout the country. And then kind of late in life got involved in local politics in the town that I was in and was persuaded to run for my town council, and I got elected. And then our very sustainability-minded energy efficiency advisory group came to us in the town of Bedford, New York, and introduced the board to this idea, PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy, which had emerged from California. And probably because I had this background in finance and was interested in local government and always been sort of at least an armchair sustainability person, I kind of gravitated to this, and that led to my, sort of really shifting my whole life and becoming involved totally in PACE. So PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy, is just an adaptation of a type of finance that's been used throughout the United States for 100 years or so to finance projects that meet a public purpose and are funded typically through bond issues that are apportioned among property owners. And so the repayment of infrastructure is often through local property taxes, where property in cities and towns throughout the United States support the functioning of local government and the installation of a lot of that infrastructure. And the adaptation with PACE which emerged in California, in Berkeley, California, and where I went to high school and college, was that energy efficiency and renewable energy resources were really a public good, and therefore could be financed on the property tax bill. And like a lot of good ideas, it took a little while for that to sort of emerge and play itself out, and it's still playing itself out in the United States. But why was that a good idea? Well, it was a good idea because it meant that the energy efficiency project on the home, or the renewable energy, the solar panels or whatnot, could be financed on a long-term basis, up to 20 or 30 years, whatever the useful life of the measure being financed was. That long-term financing could make a lot of projects immediately cash flow positive to the property owner. Because it was appended to the property tax bill, And because Americans, somewhere in the high 90%, even in the worst of economic times, pay their property taxes on time. If you don't, you can lose your property. It became it's a very good credit. It's one that Wall Street wanted to get behind. And that was important because it meant that you could borrow money at a relatively low rate of interest. Property taxes are, of course, transferable. When you sell your property here, you don't pay off all of your future property tax obligations. And so the idea was that PACE could also transfer to a new owner if the property was sold. Now that proved to be problematic for homes, but is still possible for commercial buildings. I think the other appeal to PACE was that it was actually a public-private partnership involving mostly private sector actors doing the work and providing the financing, but also it had a linkage with local government, and that may have been misused in some respects, but in the United States today, people are skeptical of government in general. I don't think I need to tell you, but local government still, is still respected to some degree, because that's where people see, change that they want in their lives. So PACE emerged in California in 2008. I think proof that it was an interesting concept and that people gravitated to it was that within 24 months, 24 different states, there are 50 in the United States, had adopted PACE enabling legislation. And then, we sort of get to by 2010 or so, we get to sort of the challenges that faced a build out of PACE. Those were fundamentally adoption by states of legislation. We got 24 quickly. A lot of the legislation was kind of sketchy and needed to be revised. And then adoption of programs. Once a state enables something, because it's locally government or agency based, there has to be sort of a program put in place, and all those things, took time. I think the nature of a public-private partnership is that, the private sector actors have certain motivations. Public sector actors may have somewhat different motivations. And so sort of sorting through all of those things took some time. Initially, and to this day, there has been opposition on the residential application of PACE from the mortgage industry and from the federal agency, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the FHFA, which oversees the mortgage giants in this country, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Their opposition, certainly in 2010, in the midst of the mortgage market meltdown, was that property taxes come before mortgages in the event of a default. So that lien priority that they were losing for the PACE financed project has led to their steady opposition, and that's made the application or the adoption of residential PACE programs throughout the United States problematic from the beginning. Early on, in the face of that opposition, we began to pivot towards commercial PACE, and we adopted a concept called lender consent, where the existing mortgage lenders on the property would consent to a project moving forward, knowing and understanding that their lien was going to be subordinate to that PACE project. And not entirely to our surprise, but somewhat to our surprise, that did not prove to be an insurmountable obstacle. And my apologies for not having slides for you. I'm going to ultimately refer you to pacenation.org's website. I'm retired now from Pace Nation, but I did just check on the site yesterday, and they have still a wealth of information on PACE and also market data, which I'll summarize for you very quickly. Another challenge, obviously the need to scale, and that comes out of all the earlier challenges that I talked about, we were really creating a new industry and a new asset class, as they like to say on Wall Street. And those things just take time and have continued to take time. But now my notes is accomplishments. Go to the stats. So I'm actually going to just very quickly, hopefully you don't lose. So on the residential PACE side, with PACE programs really operating, residential PACE programs really just in California and Florida, a little bit in Missouri, over 300,000 homes, some $7.3 billion in investment. We like to reference a lot of the, sort of the economic development, the jobs created, over 128,000 jobs created and sustained through this economic activity. Most is related to energy and water efficiency. PACE was expanded in some states pursuant to legislation to include things like water conservation, hurricane hardening in Florida. Some 20, so we attribute 70% to that and 21 or so percent to solar primarily. Resiliency, that wind hardening, roughly 9%. And on the commercial side, about $2 billion in investment, some 2,500 buildings completed, and obviously a lot of jobs as well. PACE Nation set out early on to try to collect data, and that's always challenging, but we strived to do that, and that data, such as it is available on the PACE Nation website. I think in talking to the current executive director a couple of days ago, Colin Bishop, I guess I'd cite the organization and the industry's efforts to really address consumer protection issues, which became a problem on the residential side in 2018. PACE Nation has worked with industry to develop really comprehensive consumer protections. I think there was some naivete about a lot of people in the PACE ecosphere didn't have backgrounds in consumer lending, and while you wouldn't borrow more money than you could afford to pay back, some people do, and that led to a lot of introspection, a lot of work. So I would tout that, and I'd give a shout out to one of PACE's sort of pioneers, which was Sonoma County, California, up north of San Francisco in the wine country. They have run a county-based program since the beginning that's had very few problems because it's a much more sort of hands-on approach where people come down to the county and sit across the table from somebody and really go over the project and whether it makes sense. And Jane Elias has run a great program there for years and years. I hope that's enough to sort of spark your interest and maybe generate some questions. If you have any, I'll stop there. But again, refer you to PACE Nation's website, where you can get a lot more information and resources going forward.
Thank you so much, David. That was really, really insightful and great to see a little bit more information about where it all began. Mart, would you now like to enlighten us about EUROPace's journey?
Yes, I will share my screen if the host enables me to. Thank you. Do let me know if you see it, please. A little nod, if you will. Perfect. Thank you. So I will kind of be building upon what David said. So first of all, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Mart Jacobs, and I am the European Project Manager for Genie Finance. The topic of what I will talk about will be innovative integrated home renovation services that we have been working on in G&E on the European continent, and which were originally inspired by the EUROPace concept. You will see that in these examples I am bringing, I will be talking about residential home renovation mainly, and I have brought, in my opinion, two very interesting examples to show what we've been doing here in Europe. Now, let's see. Before I kick off with my examples, I think it's best I also quickly introduce what G&E Finance, who we are and what we do. We are a high-impact investment company currently based in Barcelona, Bilbao, and Amsterdam. And we have a team of experts in different areas that are all related to the setup and management of sustainable home and building renovation programs. We are also involved in a portfolio of 8 European funded projects in 4 different countries. The ones you see on the screen here on the left-hand side are all funded within the European H2020 framework. In 3 of these projects, we at G&E Finance are also the coordinator. And in all of these projects, our focus lies with ensuring access to affordable financing and establishing the right business models for local integrated home renovation services. So now to delve a little bit deeper into the 2 examples I said I would bring to today's webinar. Well, first off, the example of EUROPace, which is also the context within which this webinar is originally developed, and in which we at G&E are a coordinator, and we actually work together with CBI, who is organizing today's webinar. So we can consider it kind of the legacy project, so to speak, for PACE implementation in the EU. And in terms of methodology of how to get started, the initial goal was to take the PACE concept and see in which countries it would be feasible to implement this. So to this end, we conducted a pretty extensive market readiness assessment, where we assessed all the legal frameworks in the different EU countries, because, you know, the fact that Europe is so heterogeneous is the beautiful aspect of it, but it's also very complicated when you want to bring such a legal mechanism to the continent. So on the basis of this market readiness assessment, we shortlisted the countries that we deemed the most feasible for PACE replication and for the implementation of EUROPace. And we also determined that in most countries, there would actually be need for a law amendment to facilitate that. And in most cases, a national law amendment on top of that, which complicates things even further, because plenty of European countries also have regional governments with their own competencies that conflict or complement the national legal framework, excuse me. So quite a complicated exercise, I would say. There was no immediate clear pathway to a straightforward PACE concept replication. Furthermore, also it became quite clear when developing the EUROPace project that we needed to take a step back and also just not focus only on the financing, but also how do we convince homeowners to renovate their homes, because it's a decision that a lot of homeowners are very hesitant to take, and not just because of the financial aspect, but actually also because of a lot of administrative and technical questions. So to that end, we actually developed a success formula, the one you see on my screen right now, which consists of 3 core factors that we worked on in the EUROPace project. Now, the technical assistance component there is pretty straightforward. That's this coordination and advice that homeowners really need to know where to start, which measures to implement. A big factor there is also bringing contractors on board of these integrated home renovation services, because we determined that homeowners' trust in contractors is also sometimes a difficult topic, an uncomfortable topic. So what we incorporated into the EUROPace project and all later replication efforts was to ensure that contractors that work with the program are in some way verified to make sure that we have that homeowner trust in them. Oops. A second element, of course, is the affordable financing, making sure that homeowners have access to either affordable loans, that they know which subsidies are available to them. And a last aspect is smart funding, because in our EUROPace programs, we work together with public authorities who obviously share the same concern that it is important that everyone has access to renovating their home, and that the energy poor who are most in need of renovating their home are not left out. So a form of smart funding through creating risk-sharing facilities to ensure that these economically vulnerable people have access to financial means to renovate their home was also a core pillar of this Trust to Renovate formula that you currently see. Now, everything you see on screen here, what I just explained, was also successfully deployed in an actual pilot. This was in the city of Olot, which is in the north of Catalonia in Spain. There we developed a one-stop shop concept, actually in Olot City Town Hall, where homeowners can walk in and find and ask experts information about all these topics that you see on my screen right now. So it is a very accessible one-stop shop. And in the parallel with implementing this one-stop shop, we also looked at the possibilities to facilitate that PACE mechanism in the Spanish national legal framework, because as I mentioned earlier, it was not yet there. There was no clear path to a PACE or on-tax financing mechanism to finance home renovation. So Genie Finance actually made some serious efforts there to combat that issue. And a national law amendment was lobbied for in order to create this possibility in Spain. However, some of you may know, may be aware of this, that Spain has suffered through a relatively volatile political framework, and of course the health crisis that hit here quite hard as well over the last years. So it's been a process that is actually still ongoing. So we're talking about a process that is taking us a couple of years here, and it is still pending. So it's important to note that in parallel with us kicking off that pilot in Olot, there's also efforts being made on the legal side to make sure that this on-tax financing mechanism does become possible in the future, to create that true PACE replication that was actually envisioned at the start of the EUROPace project. The pilot itself in Olot was rather successful, as it has been able to mobilize almost 2 million in sustainable home renovation over the course of 3 years. So we are very happy with that first pilot. And I should also say that, you know, kind of not having that on-tax financing mechanism that we envisioned in place has also not hindered us in replication of what we have successfully created under the EUROPace project. So I already mentioned the pilot in Catalonia, but currently in the Spanish territory, we have 2 more replication efforts, one being in the Basque Country, the Open Gala program, which also works with local one-stop shops that homeowners have easy access to, and which is mainly focused on vulnerable neighborhoods. And there is the Regenerate project, which actually very recently kicked off in June of this year, which will replicate our efforts created under EUROPace on the Balearic Islands of Ibiza, Palma, and Menorca. Now, following up on the EUROPace project, which the project itself actually ended officially on the 31st of August this year, but all its programs and replication efforts are still ongoing. I want to highlight another example on the European continent, which in our eyes at Genie is the most successful replication effort of the PACE concept in Europe to date. And that is the Fit Home project, which is active in the Netherlands. And we work with our Dutch partners from the Woonpas there. And they, as I said, have managed to successfully deploy an on-tax financing mechanism for sustainable home retrofits. This is also a project that was funded by the European Commission with the goal of retrofitting more than 900 family homes, and by virtue of that, mobilizing 15 million euro in sustainable home renovation. Now, why do I say that this is probably the most successful replication of PACE in Europe? Our partners at the Woonpas have actually made a very smart use of an existing legal mechanism that's called the betterment tax, or the badbelasting. Now, the underlying nature of this tax is the idea that the public authority can tax its citizens for improvements made to usually public spaces, which they benefit from. As you may deduct from the way I explained this, this is not a legal framework that was created specifically for home renovation or for untaxed financing to finance home renovation, which is what it is being used for in the Fit Home project. So de facto, that means that we are kind of working with a gray zone here. There has actually been some national discussions about this type of use of the mechanism, namely it being used for other improvements to citizens' lives that are not related to public spaces, but to home renovation. That's been a discussion that's been ongoing the past year mostly. Has that discussion been settled in the meantime? No, it has not. Basically, it has faded away instead of gone away or been settled completely. So it's still a little bit of a question mark. But the fact that the discussion on this use of the betterment tax died down last year allowed our partners at the Woonpas to actually continue their activities and as such show the success of the Fit Home program, which is now really snowballing because the Fit Home project piloted with a small neighborhood in a Dutch province 1 year ago. And because it is truly successful with homeowners, we are now seeing that it is expanding exponentially in that province, and we are very excited to see this. And we also believe that this will positively influence that conversation about this use of untaxed financing on the national level, if and when it pops up again. So this betterment tax, it actually creates the same benefits as those created by the PACE mechanism, as was just explained by David before me. For example, it is a tax linked to the property. So when the homeowner sells his or her property, the tax remains with that improved property and not with the person. It doesn't follow the person who was living there. Now, as I indicated before, this example is currently the most successful use of untaxed financing or PACE-inspired financing in Europe. And we have not yet found other legal frameworks that offer such a great opportunity as this one in the Netherlands. We are often also facing a lot of political inertia. The Spain example is a good example of this when it comes to changing existing legal frameworks, because politics is complicated, not just in Europe, but everywhere. But it is complicated, and a lot of political will is needed to change these frameworks to enable this mechanism to be used. So on the basis of that, we do think that a true large-scale replication of the PACE financing mechanism or untaxed financing for sustainable home renovation on the European continent will take some time. Now, not to use too much time, I will conclude here with the Fit Home example, but I do invite you to visit the project website as well, or contact me if you want any additional information about this project. Now, to wrap up my presentation, do I think it is a coincidence that successful PACE replication has emerged in the Netherlands? No, probably not, because this is one of the EU countries that lends itself best to public-private partnerships in general, because there is a culture with the public authorities there where they are already kind of used to working with private actors, and they are comfortable in working with the private sector. And we don't see that as much in, for example, Spain or Belgium, where we've held a workshop as well, where there is still this fear when it comes to these public-private partnerships that are really necessary for a successful collaboration within the context of EUROPace or PACE replication in general. So moving forward, we know that there are these legal or political barriers currently, but we do believe that, for example, with the Fit Home example currently up and running, over time we will see more and more of these innovative initiatives. And with that, I am wrapping up. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks, Mart. It's really interesting to learn from your examples just how innovative some of these projects need to be. Emma, handing over to you. Can you enlighten us on the UK situation?
Cheers, thanks, Clodagh. And hopefully some slides will come up on the screen very shortly. I think just to give the UK context for decarbonising buildings, in the UK, buildings are responsible for 23% of the UK's carbon emissions, 77% of which are due to homes. So we clearly have a significant decarbonisation challenge in the UK. And the UK's Committee on Climate Change, in their 6th carbon budget last year, estimated that £250 billion of investment is going to be needed to decarbonise homes. So very clearly a significant investment required. Now, we at the Green Finance Institute believe that we're going to need a mix of different financing solutions to bridge that investment gap. And what we do at the GFI, the Green Finance Institute, is we convene coalitions of global experts from all different sectors to look at particular sectors of the economy, be that buildings, transport, or nature, and collaboratively design and bring to market the financial solutions that are needed to get investment moving into that sector. Now, on the built environment programme that we run, called the Coalition for the Energy Efficiency of Buildings, we identified PACE, or what we call in the UK property-linked finance, as a critical solution for getting capital into decarbonising homes. Now, property-linked finance is a very new concept in the UK to some extent. We previously had something called the Green Deal, which was on-bill financing. However, it suffered a number of different barriers. However, it's provided a very useful test case for us to learn from as we look to implement property-linked finance. Now, today, rather than going into ins and outs of the different mechanisms we're exploring to bring this type of financing into the UK, I thought it'd be interesting just to share some of the consumer research that we've done recently and just share some of the insights in terms of how UK citizens feel towards energy efficiency, financing more generally for energy efficiency, and then property-linked finance. So as you'll see on the next slide, over 80% of the UK citizens that we surveyed said that energy efficiency was important to them. However, almost 50% didn't know what their energy performance certificate rating was for their home, and a further 10% had never heard of EPC ratings. So there is a will to decarbonise, but unfortunately a lack of information and education. However, an interesting finding from the research was the motivators for people to want to decarbonise their home. Number one was a desire to reduce bills, and then there was a real desire to improve the quality of life, as well as more altruistic drivers for improving the environment. And I'm sure these are very common themes across all the countries that are represented on the call today. So once we had an understanding that people wanted to decarbonise their homes, we then started to explore the financing solutions they wanted to use. So as you see on the next slide, the UK is traditionally a relatively debt-averse and conservative country when it comes to financing. When we spoke to the participants in the questionnaire and the survey, 25% said that they would consider using external financing. 45% said that they were unlikely. And we found that there was a clear split in demographic of people who were interested in using financing. These were typically younger, male, they had a mortgage on their property, and they were the sole financial decision maker in their household. Now, the reason, when we probed a little bit further into why people wouldn't want to use external financing for energy efficiency improvements, it was typically felt that people didn't need to use financing, or they preferred to pay for items up front. However, we know that retrofits can cost £10,000, £20,000, £30,000 upwards. and average savings in the UK are significantly lower than that. So again, there's an information gap and an education gap in terms of understanding how much investment is needed to decarbonise a home and what is viable in terms of savings and financing. So then, to get through to the meat of the survey, as you see on the next slide, we then asked the participants. We said, if you had to improve your property, how appealing would property-linked finance be? And 64% said that they were likely or open to using a property-linked financing scheme in the future. And that was particularly strong in the cohort who were interested and already comfortable with financing solutions. Those who were comfortable with finance and were relatively financially savvy immediately saw the benefits of linking a repayment, the financial repayment, to a property, and the opportunity to cover almost all of the costs through a property-linked financing solution. And another appealing factor was the ability to use property-linked financing for a range of different energy efficiency measures, which plays into one of David's points around expanding the energy efficiency to water efficiency, etc. For those who were less confident about using the scheme, it was actually that long-term property-linked nature that was also one of the concerns. There were concerns about what would be the impacts on property values, how would this impact any sales on the property and the conveyancing process, etc. So I think I'll say this for the third time, but clearly an education piece needed. And I'm sure this is a similar finding that's happened through the USPace scheme and through EUROPace, that close local engagement and education and that introduction of trust along the value chain is absolutely essential. So where are we going next as the Green Finance Institute and Property Linked Finance in the UK? Well, we believe that there is a mechanism in the UK called a local land charge, which can help to link financing to a property. We explored the other existing property taxes in the UK, including council tax. However, it's felt that that was a suboptimal route to go in terms of linking financing to a property. We're also starting to explore with a number of regions, both in the UK, Wales and Scotland, the opportunity to establish pilot schemes with investment from development banks, but also from institutional investors, which we think are going to be a critical funder to actually scale up property-linked financing in the UK. So to wrap up, I think we've seen that, or our research has shown that there is demand for property-linked finance. There's a need to introduce it sensitively and with those local connections and local support to make homeowners comfortable. But if there is, we have already a number of local authorities and institutional investors lined up who want to be part of a growing wave that is taking off both in the UK, but clearly, as we'll see from the call today, internationally. So thanks very much, and I'll hand back to Clodagh.
Thanks, Emma. That's really interesting to get such a level of detail into what the consumers are thinking. Really, really insightful. And now we're traveling to the other side of the world, to Gary Zhao.
Thank you, Clodagh. Grateful for Emma's perfect transition, because let me share my screen first. That it's not allowed to share screen. Am I put as a host, Clodagh?
Louisa, would you be able to do that?
You should be able to share a screen now, Gary.
Thank you.
Okay, let me try again. As a host.
You should be able to see a green share screen icon at the bottom of your screen.
Yes, awesome, got it. There we go. Perfect. So yeah, let me introduce a little bit about the company I work for, which is BRE, and also a bit about myself, because it's also a British company, which makes it a perfect sequence and logically making a lot of sense. And for BRE, we are actually a research establishment, and given the current trend of decarbonization in the world, China, I think, is on top of it. I'm living in Shanghai, China, and it's actually 7-something p.m. so it's getting dark out there. But it's really a very interesting topic, and it's a great pleasure for me of mine to share some thoughts with all the guests and all the speakers today. So the topic I can come up with is about carbon and building, because I've heard a lot around the financing topic, but only until recent years that such topic becomes relevant and integrated with carbon and with buildings. So about BRE itself as a company, I don't want to make this too overly commercialized, but to establish where we are, to establish what type of expertise we have, to put us in the position where we could actually study the buildings, especially on the built environment side of things, and also to connect that type of research with some of the situation in China, with some of the findings, some of our customers and our showcasing projects in China. So we've been doing building research for over 100 years. This is actually the 100th-year anniversary of BRE. So interestingly, it's mostly for the past century, the research around building is mostly around the technical side, around the engineering side, including myself too, because I have a background knowledge from a HVAC engineer. And it used to be somewhat similar to the feeling that it's always about engineers' carnivals. We are so keen, or used to be so keen, on analyzing on the technical side, studying what type of solution that the industry have to allow buildings to operate from a low energy consuming perspective. What could we do to actually reduce the energy consumption, and then as in summary, to reduce the carbon emission and save the world and all that. But until recent years, specifically, the ESG concept has been brought up by, I think, most of the financiers to the engineers world. So it's starting to make a lot of sense why in the past we've been struggling a lot to understand and tackle the challenge when it comes to refurbishing buildings, refurbishing assets. It's always about returns. It's all about what benefits do we actually enjoy after we design and upgrade the building and finishing the fittings, trying to apply those technologies, apply those solutions from the industry to the actual projects. So I'm going to dwell a little bit on this slide, because when the capital market is actually in place, it's actually being mentioned. It's important to bridge the knowledge gap, not just in China, but I also believe it's the same situation for the rest of the world as well, between asset level and capital level. Because when it comes to financing, when it comes to the investors or fund managers or asset owners from a corporate level, the lack of data is hindering a lot of decision making. Because I personally interview a lot of asset owners from gigantic developers, from fund managers, from asset holders and operators, etc. They all have the same trouble, have the same pain, lack of data. So it's like you don't even know the shoe size that you're buying. How could you actually purchase a building? How could you actually make financing decisions upon those assets? So the data transparency is obviously the key here, but it's not as easy as you would imagine to be able to get a hold of the carbon data attached to your buildings. One could imagine that it's fairly easy for me to know the energy bill of my home, the place I live in. But imagine when you have 5 assets, 10 assets, and even 100 assets spread out across a country as big as China, spread out in 10 different cities. How challenging it could be to gather carbon data, not just raw data, but more importantly, data gathered from a scientific approach. You might have the energy bill, but how does it transfer to carbon data? What type of methodology should be in place given different climate zones, given different operating hours and different functions of the assets? Some of them are residential, some of them are museums, libraries, office buildings, etc. All those buildings operate differently under different presumptions. So it's of ultimate importance and critical value to get a hold of the data. So in terms of BRE itself, we've been studying building and assets for many, many years. And I'm so proud to say that BREEAM, as some of you might know already, is one of the world-leading green building standards. And in current years, it's been evolving not just to assess a building, but also allows asset owners and operators to extract certain data from your assets and provide an approach to report the data to upstream, to the investors, to the financiers in a scientific way. So with certain tools that we produce from BRE facing our customers, it allows them to effectively gather data, not just carbon data, because some would say sustainability is like a moving target. It's carbon, it's net zero these years for China. In future, it could be different. But to tackle the ultimate challenge, which is to save the world, I think we need to stick to the scientific approach, which is what BRE is keen on doing. So for buildings specifically, it's not just about the operation data, but it's also about the embodied carbon data, which is even more of a challenge, because when you think about the building materials that you use in your buildings, think about the furnitures, the waste, the raw materials that's extracted to produce the furniture that you enjoy in your home. You could drag out a whole chain of carbon data in the industry, and what are the scopes? What are the responsibilities? Where are the responsibilities being placed? That could be somewhat more of a policy making issue, not just from an individual perspective, not just from a tenant perspective, but also it's vastly important to create such policies that regulates the data collection, regulates the use of the data, so that it could be used for better analysis and better functions to advocate financing decisions. So that's part of the most important experience and what we observe from the China market, because we've been only starting in China for the past 3 to 4 years. And it's obvious that in China, people tend to do their projects in a hurried pace. But in future, I think with the carbon neutrality goals set by super higher up in the government, it would bring a campaign nationwide, if not already, to decarbonize all the buildings. And that would advocate a lot of changes to happen in place. So I think that could be the trend we observe. And obviously for the future decades, it's one of the key topics in China, if not the most important one. So that would be the summary of my slides and presentation. And hopefully you could actually promote some of the questions, and really looking forward to exchange some views with the others. Thanks. I'll pass it back to Coda.
Thank you so much, Gary. That was really, really helpful. And finally, we head even further away to Shay. And apologies, Shay, for leaving you to last, given that it's practically the middle of the night for you. So I very much appreciate that you're still with us.
That's okay. Thank you, Claudia. And kia ora everyone, and a very good afternoon to you all. It is almost 1 a.m. here in Auckland. I am the head of strategic partnership for Tether Limited. Tether is an IT company that focuses on building science. We provide sensors to measure building performance, but we also digitally model buildings and capture their condition. And then we are able to outlay the real-time performance metrics to monitor how the homes respond to occupant behavior. I'm wearing 2 hats today. Since 2010 until early this year, I was living in Australia. So I was involved in the launch of the Environmental Upgrade Finance Program, which is an adaptation of the PACE program. And it's currently available in 3 states in Australia, which is in Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia. And since I've moved back to New Zealand, I'm also in the process of working very hard to lobby the New Zealand government here to have a similar program to enable housing retrofits in New Zealand. We have a shocking quality of existing homes, and there's a very right market there for a finance mechanism like PACE. In Australia, when we started off, by the way, I don't have any slides, so I'll just talk through. The environmental upgrade program was started for City of Melbourne in 2010. Initially, it was a pilot just for one council in Victoria, and that was Melbourne City Council. And in order for that to happen, the council had to amend the City of Melbourne Act. As it was mentioned previously, in most cases, there has to be an amendment to either at state level or federal level to the laws to enable the program. So in Victoria, it was started with City of Melbourne, and then 5 years later, the Local Government Act was amended. Therefore, any council could opt in. So to date, there are 40 local councils that are offering environmental upgrade finance in the state of Victoria. In New South Wales in 2011, the state government didn't go through a pilot process, but enabled the Local Government Act so any councils could participate, and also provided some grant funding for, I think it was 6 councils, to help them set up their program. That program didn't go very well. What had happened was as soon as the money ran out, the grant funding ran out, the councils didn't really invest any of their own money. And apart from the 6 initial councils, none of the other councils came on board, and there wasn't a large uptake of projects either. So it was also previously mentioned that education is the key, and so that the building owners in the finance sector and the local government, for that matter, understand how the finance mechanism works, and that still remains a challenge. Back in 2019, we were able to get some funding from the federal government to basically grow the EUA market nationally, and through the funding available in that program, we were able to restart the New South Wales program. So currently there's 8 councils there. When I say we, at that stage, I was working for the Sustainable Melbourne Fund, which later became Sustainable Australia Fund, which is to date is the main driver, the organisation is the main driver in growing the EUA market in Australia. South Australia sort of followed suit, but they took quite a while to draft their legislation. They didn't actually start until 2017. Their program didn't start, and when they were drafting their legislation, they took components from both the Victorian and the New South Wales legislation, and there's components of both in that, which I'll talk about. And currently there's 9 councils in South Australia that are offering EUAs. There are differences in legislation and in the 3 states, and what we're finding is that that can also lead to complications in growing the market, especially for smaller countries. In New South Wales, for example, a building owner can pass the charge onto the tenant without consent, so long as they can demonstrate that the tenant is not worse off. Whereas in Victoria, the building owner is required to have a written consent. In South Australia, the building owner has the option of either go the no worse off test path or a written consent pathway. There's also enabling legislation in Victoria for residential buildings. The legislation was passed at the end of 2019, and unfortunately, COVID hit. So to date, there hasn't been a residential program launched, but the enabling legislation is there. In South Australia, the legislation also allows for heritage upgrades to the building. And also the 3 states have different loan to value ratio requirements. In Victoria, with a combined debt on the asset, the building owners can borrow up to 100% of the building value, whereas in South Australia, the threshold is at 80%. The New South Wales legislation does not stipulate any such requirement for the purpose of the program. And the program also has different names. So in Victoria, it's Environmental Upgrade Finance. In South Australia, they started with Building Upgrade Finance. New South Wales started with Environmental Upgrade Finance and later changed to Building Upgrade Finance. So, different names also cause confusion as well. And the way the programs were rolled out in each state was different as well. In Victoria, Sustainable Melbourne Fund became the administrator for Melbourne City Council, when Melbourne City Council at the time owned Sustainable Melbourne Fund. So when the program became available to other state councils across the state, because the program was already running and everything was set up for one council, it was easy to replicate the same across for any councils that wanted to participate in the program. It made it easy. So therefore, Sustainable Melbourne Fund became a third-party administrator for local governments in Victoria, and they offered the service under a different brand called Better Building Finance. So effectively, it's the same set of rules, same documentation. Whichever of those 40 councils you go to, it's the same process. In New South Wales, each council that was participating in the program set up their own program and their own processes, different documentation requirements, so there's slight variations there. In South Australia, the state government appointed a central facilitator, and the role of the central facilitator was to help any council that wants to join the program and try and standardize it as well. There were some wins in the program. Having a standardized program made it easier for council participation, and that is reflected in the fact that in Victoria there's 40 councils, whereas the other states have 8 and 9. It was championed by the sustainability officers and economic development officers because it was a tool that they can take to their ratepayers. When they're promoting energy efficiency program or building retrofit program, here was one way you can pay for it through your council. And it worked really well for those departments. The challenge really came through the rates departments who had to actually operationalize and collect the funds. There was pushback from that because this is not core activity for councils, and councils are already resource constraints. So, when it came to getting approval from councils to offer this type of finance mechanism, the cost to council became a key concern, and in some cases a barrier for uptake as well. So the way we overcame that was we offered the third-party administration service to councils free of charge, but there was a fee charged to the building owner for each application that was made. And there were some challenges as well. One of the biggest challenges was the constrained market. A 5-year pilot just for the city of Melbourne. Financiers were not really willing to spend money in creating a finance product that could only be applied to one municipality. Everybody was waiting. They want a large open market so that they can make money as fast as they can, because that's what financiers do. And that became a challenge for us because, it was very hard to engage with the big banks, because they'd be like, yes, this makes sense. We can see it's a good product. The security is super senior, but it's such a small market. We're going to wait until there's a demonstrable market. So they're looking like $100 million market. Before that, they would dip their toe in this. And to date, that still hasn't happened. And similarly, in New South Wales, there was only half a dozen councils. So once again, there was reluctance as well. So what happened is it meant that Sustainable Melbourne Fund, which later became Sustainable Australia Fund, sort of financed most of the projects in Victoria. What also then happened is then under its service arm of Better Building Finance, because it wasn't a totally independent third-party administrator, then that also sort of became a concern for some councils and financiers to say, how do we know it'll be an independent process per se? So there was challenges in the setup as well. So one of the key learnings was that, the third-party administrator needs to be totally independent, especially from financiers. What the other concern was, some councils through the application process were trying to use the EUA process as a way to leverage building owners to pay the outstanding other rates, before they would approve their finance application. So we kind of have to have a battle it out with council to say you need to keep the two separate. So there were a number of things that came out of this. And what it has the way it has to work is that the PACE program has to be adapted to the region, but keeping the process simple is the key to it because it reduces barrier to entry from building owners' point of view and also reduces transaction costs for the financiers. For the New Zealand context, as I mentioned earlier, we have a very poor housing policy. We have a housing crisis at two fronts. One is affordability, but the other one is existing homes that are mold, cold and damp, and that's causing health issues as well. So we have been, doing stakeholder engagement, talking to the Green Building Council and Property Council, local government New Zealand, and also community housing groups. And there's a lot of support for this type of finance mechanism. We officially written to the Minister for Housing and the Minister for Local Government. That was done a few months ago. Currently, the Local Government Act is under review, and government is looking for different ways to support the community, especially when it comes to financing for building retrofits. We haven't received any official response from the government to say they're considering it. We've had response from different departments to say they've read it and passed it on to the next department. So currently we are waiting, and hopefully at some point in the future we will have a pace-style finance mechanism in New Zealand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shay. I'm very conscious of time and the demands I've already placed on all of the panelists. But if I might ask just one quick question before I let you go about your day or night. When conducting research and in my conversations with all of you, I became acutely aware that this is very much an initiative where one size does not fit all. And therefore it can be quite challenging. What would you all say if you had one key takeaway or lesson learned to give to the audience? What would you say it would be if you can narrow it down to one? David, do you want to go first? You're on mute.
No, when you asked if I wanted to go first, I said no.
Oh, sorry about that.
I'm dreading this question. I guess reflecting my thoughts on all of this, in the United States, where there's been pretty good, build out. I wish there was a greater sense of urgency in this country about climate issues in general and the need for all property owners, since half the energy we consume in this country is used in buildings and 75% of the electricity until everyone has a Tesla. And so just this sort of, instead of just looking at sidings and windows and doors and things that people want to cosmetically improve their homes, how about, really getting to the point where we really understand that there's an urgent crisis here. Here and everywhere. And the other thing, I think, the other two things that I would flag, because this is very decentralized, and Mark talked about this, it's different everywhere in every jurisdiction. At least in the United States, I think there's been a move to try to standardize things, even though legislation is different in every state, unfortunately, and within jurisdictions, the standardization of processes streamlines things. And the last thing I was just going to flag was data. I used to say to everybody in the PACE world, data is our only friend, and if it's not friendly to us, we don't have any friends at all. And so the need to collect data, helps us show what we're accomplishing, and not just the numbers of projects and the dollars spent, but also how much carbon are we actually, addressing and mitigating, or eliminating. And that's always a challenge as well. So I guess, I don't know, those are the three thoughts that popped into my head.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Mart?
Well, talking about the European perspective, obviously this kind of standardization is just simply not an option from a legal perspective in Europe. So to just keep it very short, it's the thing I also highlighted when I was speaking, is that need for political valor, to call it that way, to push ahead with these changes that are needed for on-tax financing to be implemented here. And I think these first movers, like, for example, Fit Home, are crucial in showing the more hesitant public authorities that, hey, there is something to be done here, and seeing the successes will hopefully promote that movement to grow.
Gary, how about from your side?
Yes, obviously, I think climate change is a huge issue, and a huge issue so important that it could never be tackled through one-sided effort. It needs to be from both top-down and bottom-up, because from top-down level, only if the government could regulate strongly in terms of how enterprises and individuals should behave to change the current lifestyle, to input more resources on the decarbonization, not just through a campaign, but through regulation. I think policies, incentives, regulators, these are all crucial. But in the meantime, it all goes down to every individual, every company, every corporate that needs to start making a tiniest change that's within their range, within their power. So all factors would accumulate to the top up. I think it could only work from both ways, from from both sides that could make the change we need to make good things happen before everything comes too late. I think that's probably my takeaway.
And finally, Shay, you had the last word.
Based on my experience, I really hope that the local government processes, is sort of brought up to align with the current climate, especially if they're looking for private sector funding to support some of their programs, because it's cumbersome, it's inefficient, and it really makes it hard for people to participate in this kind of program. That's been one of the challenges I found. So really, they need to really look at their processes and bring it to the 21st century, if I could be that bold. Yeah.
Makes sense. Well, that brings us to the end of the webinar. I would like to thank all of our panelists for a very, very insightful discussion and indeed their time. And would also like to thank all of the attendees. The recording will be available on the CBI website soon. Thank you all very much. Take care.
Thank you.